if you look at the upper left image, I think the initial slide was a sort of a detail of the so-called fruit in Les Demoiselles. And the accompanying text in that initial slide was, upon this fruit, Horus has an eye. Now, it's my thesis, again, I have a lot of theses about this fruit, that what you're looking at is a concealed depiction of the Eye of Horus on the fruit. And if you follow my cursor, I'll explain. Now, in the composition of the Eye of Horus, every one of these elements has a name and a numerical value. I'm not going to get into that, but this Wedjat, as it's known sometimes, the Eye of Horus, is basically composed of these elements. So we have an eyebrow, we have an eye, and sometimes with an extension like this, and then we have this diagonal, and then we have a vertical here. This diagonal, the eyebrow, the eye, and the pupil. So these are the sort of main elements of the Wedjat. Now, we've got the same thing going on here. This is the eyebrow above. The eye is not very clear. Again, Picasso's not being very clear with us, but I have an extremely strong suspicion this is what he's been doing. He's hidden an Eye of Horus element here. And so we have this is where the eye is. This is the vertical, which he's kind of readdressed, and he's made it more of a diagonal. And this is the diagonal. So the whole thing's kind of slightly out of kilter. But we've got all the elements there. And you can see that he's been playing with this concept of the Eye of Horus. Another encrypted or hidden, concealed, occulted Eye of Horus form in the face of our African friend again. And I'm going to show you where that is. Now, we've already discussed this one below if you watch my cursor. So here's our traditional Wedjat form on this beautiful pendant necklace, and here's Picasso's rendition of the Eye of Horus on the fruit. Now we come across to the thing that you may remember I described as a boat, a little sailing boat, this form here. And on the musical slideshow I said Horus also has an eye on a little sailing boat, sailing for the sky, sort of bit of a rhyming thing. But here's the Eye of Horus. Here is the eyebrow. Here is the eye. This is the vertical, but it's interrupted and it continues here. And here is the diagonal. It's not making it obvious for us, but there is a very distinct Eye of Horus concealed in that face and the deformed hand that it's supposed to be resting in. So here we have a second Egyptian indication. It is a shadow, I believe, of the god Horus on the ground, showing that he's present in this picture. And we'll get to see him a number of times. He is present. That this shape that appears in orange is suggestive of a sphinx. So why a sphinx? Okay, well, we have to look at some other images to see the Egyptian landscape. And set within that Egyptian landscape, we have typical elements that one would expect to find, suggestions of the River Nile, suggestions of the desert, suggestions of pyramids, and here a sphinx. And again, on this sphinx, we have an Eye of Horus. And in fact, we have more than the suggestion of Horus. We have the head of Horus here, if you follow my cursor. This is the falcon-like head of Horus. And what I think Picasso was playing with was creating a sphinx type form in this imaginary landscape of his. Now, you've got to remember that he liked to go to places like the Louvre and museums and so on, and he was fascinated by this, and his occult friends, you know, this was all very meaningful to him at the time and later in life, because he makes continual reference to this throughout his career, to these kind of occulted belief systems. And you can see, I think I mentioned it before, the suggestion of an eye in the correct placement on this head. And Picasso does this throughout later. So a sphinx, and the suggestion of a wave rolling along. So now the sail of the sailing boat, it takes on the form of a wave. This is the beautiful poetic quality of Picasso's imagery, the way one thing can become another that it's closely associated with. He does this a great deal, and I know of no other artist that is capable of this. And the sunrise here, sort of rising up on the Sphinx, and all around it, sort of desert, sandy scenes. So we'll take a little departure from the slideshow and have a look at some of the landscape. Now, please bear in mind that Picasso was concealing this, so he spread it all through Les Demoiselles. And these elements are to be found in dislocated locations and so on and so forth. But when you put it all together, we have a very Nilotic Egyptian kind of landscape beside the Nile, with the elements of the sand and the pyramids, the Sphinx, the sunrise, even the moonrise, sunset. All these elements are included, including the River Nile and all the other things. But I just want to show you here how I see it. So we've got a suggestion of the river rolling along here towards along the bottom, and we've got the same on the other side of the picture. We've got these sort of watery, aquatic kind of suggestions here, and then here we have pyramids, which I mentioned before. I mean, very clearly pyramids, and right next to the pyramids, the Sphinx. We've got the wave elements here, the Eye of Horus. Here, the sunrise just above this Sphinx here. So, you know, what we're looking at is a landscape. Now, Picasso did do landscapes. He's not well known for it, but I've seen quite a few Picasso landscapes, and they're remarkably good. And what he's done here is incorporated hidden, cryptic kind of landscapes within Les Demoiselles, and we'll have a look at another one. Now, what we get here along this area, if you follow my cursor, is a clear and distinct impression of a landscape. You know, elements that look like they're tree cover or something. Perhaps a sunset, looks like a bit of a moonrise or something going on in a strange location here, a mountain, and distinctly distant view of a landscape with, in the foreground here, elements that look like hills and desert scenery. And here, perhaps watery elements. I can distinctly get the impression of waves rolling along and even a boat. This is a very distinct, clear impression of a landscape. So this was the subsequent image in the slideshow, and the text that I used to accompany that was something along the lines of, and Isis lays her hand on her murdered husband's crown. Now, there's a reason for all that, and we'll come to it in the next slide. But what I'd like you to see, if you would, where I've highlighted indications in the painting that there's a sort of Egyptian headdress with some kind of frontal emblem here coming up, possibly one of these Uraeus type snake kind of forms coming out of the headdress. It's certainly got that distinctive shape about it, and within that area there is a concealed head, and in fact the body seems to continue down here. Now, in this head, which we're going to have a look a little bit more closely in the next image, I'll put a comparative image up so you can see this more clearly. Okay, so here's a comparative image, and I've selected and combined two images, one from a very clear photograph under bright lighting conditions, and one using the image that I employed most of the time to find the concealed imagery in Les Demoiselles, that being the one on the right. In the dimmer lighting conditions, or lighting conditions that are more subdued rather, or perhaps by firelight or something. Certainly not under bright electric lighting conditions that bring out every little line and stroke. So Picasso has employed some kind of technique to incorporate hidden imagery under subdued lighting, and probably working at a distance and employing a very, very clever technique. What I want to show is this idea that there's a hidden head in here. And now, it's my contention that this is a representation of the goddess Isis, looking for the dismembered parts of her husband's body. She's laying in a boat, going along the Nile, perhaps at night, I'm not sure, and she is in the company of Horus, and she's looking for the dismembered parts of her husband's body, and incorporated in this boat, in the bow of the boat, we have the head of Osiris. And within that area, there are distinct shapes. There it is here more clearly on this side. This shape that in the dimmer light takes on the form of an emblem on the crown of the headdress of this concealed head. Now, it's very indistinct. It's hard to see, but it's my contention that Picasso hid this in here, and, you know, on a magical level. Like most of this hidden stuff, it's all been done on an alchemical level, perhaps in his belief about the picture to empower the picture somehow. Okay, and we're going to get into why it was so important to Picasso as we proceed into this. Now, a couple of features that are worth mentioning. So what I'm suggesting is we've got a prone body of Osiris, like the spirit of Osiris, actually, with the head here, and the shoulders would be about here, and the rest, and his back going down. So he's resting on his chest. That's his head, and here's his eye, which you'll note in the Museum of Modern Art image here. You can't even see it, but here you can see the suggestion of it. This is why the lighting is so important in the photography. You know, it just brings things out in a different way. Now, one thing that's really kind of interesting about this, you need to look at it for quite a while before you see the impression of the head. you see the impression of a nose and where the mouth is, and perhaps even the chin. And then the headdress becomes more clear with time as you're looking at it. And so it's an indistinct thing. And what I'm driving at, really, I might as well get down to it, is that in these areas, which just look like scumbled sort of areas where he hasn't applied any paint, there are these little areas, these little parts where there is no paint. They take on the form of stars in this darker lighting circumstances. So what we've got is this image of Osiris traveling up through the universe, through past the stars. Now we'll have a look at this more closely. I don't want you to just kind of believe what I'm saying, but I'd like you to see it as well, because I believe it was intentional and I believe it can be seen. And I don't think I'm about ready for the crazy house just yet, but there's some poetic stuff going on here. And one of the things that I became aware of is that the nose of this hidden, concealed face looks very, very peculiarly similar to a belly button, to this idea of a in Spanish it's called an ombligo, this idea of where the life force comes into the newborn, and where in the nose area it leaves the old. So we've got this kind of poetic association. There's something about this that looks very similar to me to a belly button. It's got some kind of three-dimensional quality that you can see more clearly in a blown-up image of it. But in the brightly lit version, you don't see anything at all. It's just the smear of paint. And similarly, where you've got the eye, there's very little. There's very little to be seen. So this is not a good image to be using, and for some of this stuff. So the dark elements, these brown dark thing, what I'm suggesting is Picasso was using this as a sort of a view of the night sky, okay, and the spirit of Osiris rising up through the night sky, and these are the stars that he's traveling past on his way to his final destination. So now that's pretty deep, and I will endeavor to supplement that with some kind of corroborative information and images that show that this was a preoccupation with him. He used it. He employs it in Guernica. He employs it in the Three Dances. This idea of the dead soul traveling to the stars, and we see it in its embryonic phase in the burial of Casagemus, where he's riding on Pegasus. The spirit of Casagemus is rising up to the heavens. So this is something that Picasso was prone to repeat through the 30s and the 20s, and he's employed it in Les Demoiselles as well. So I'm not expecting you to believe every word I say. As I suggested, we'll move in, and some of this will start to fall into place as we proceed. So we've got a number of elements that I've previously talked about, as well as some new ones. So we've got this landscape. We've got the aspect of the suggested boat and the River Nile going along, and we've got the suggested form of this figure who I'm saying is the goddess Isis, looking for the parts of her husband's dismembered body. And she's laying in a boat and she's going along, possibly at night, it's hard to say, and she is collecting and gathering up the dismembered parts of Osiris's body. At the same time, the spirit of Osiris, who is embodied in that boat, is traveling to the stars. Now, it's quite a lot to take on board. Please forgive the pun. But if you bear with me, I'll endeavor to elucidate. Now, this was the shadow of Horus underfoot here. Okay, so now let's move over here. Here is Horus. This is, I believe, an image of Horus, again concealed in the body parts of this central figure, but it's got the clear and distinct impression of a bird's body and head, suggestion of a beak, and it's resting. It's at rest, seated somewhere here, and it's accompanying Isis in her search for the dismembered body parts of her husband, her murdered husband. And this is totally traditional Egyptian mythology going on in Les Demoiselles d'Avignon. We've got the boat, we've got the River Nile, we've got the accompaniment of Horus, and we've got the Egyptian landscape set before us, and we've got, if you look very closely in this diseased leg, these are chunks of cut meat. It's not some modernistic way of painting. It's nothing to do with flattening picture planes and fracturing the image into some new type of painting called cubism. These are meaningful shapes, and this is meat. These are chunks of meat of her husband. Okay, just let you digest that for a second. So she's laying in a boat. She's accumulated some of the dismembered body parts by going through all the different provinces of Egypt. And now in Egyptian iconography and ways of depicting this story, the timeline was circular. So even though at one point in the suggested legend, one of the characters hadn't yet been born, he can still appear. And it's quite frequent in Egyptian imagery of this story and others that a future event can be present in a past scene. So it would be quite normal for Horus, the son of Osiris, to be looking for the body parts, which is what he did in the myth, along with his mother, his future mother, even though he hasn't been born yet. So there's this sort of circular timeline. Time is not linear in Egyptian. In the Egyptian way of looking at things. And so concurrently with that, you can have the spirit of Osiris traveling to the stars in the boat. I think it was called the Sekhmet boat, I'm not sure, or the Nekhmet boat. I really don't remember. But this idea of the soul traveling to the heavens in a boat. Okay, so that's this is, now we're really kind of getting into the, again, forgive the pun, the meat of the story. And so for all the formalists, please, think again, because these are meaningful representational images in traditional art, going all the way back through Harlequin, through Mercury, through Hermes Trismegistus, who his close friends at the turn of the century, people like Max Jacob, Guillaume Apollinaire, associated him with Hermes Trismegistus, whose origins were in the Egyptian god Toth, the founder of civilization, the measurer of the earth, and the principal agent of the sun god Ra. And Toth was the originator of all art, which in its earliest form was a type of magic. It was an extension of the idea of writing. It was representational. We see that in the hieroglyphics. And it was a type of magic. And this is, in a way, a level. This was one kind of level that Picasso was employing his art in a similar way to the Surrealists to affect changes in the world around them. And so I just wanted to go back to that. I showed this image at the end of a talk. I didn't actually discuss it, but you can see the clear association going on. What Picasso's playing with, okay? And he'll embark on a sort of a journey of linked associated images. And here we've got one of these old master painters, Velasquez or somebody, doing the same thing as Toth. And Picasso does this time and time and time again. And what he's telling us is, I'm the Harlequin, I'm Toth, I'm that fella, I'm the one who gave you art. And this is kind of where he's coming from in this in this career of his, this illustrious career that the museums think is some kind of modern development, and they're completely wrong. It isn't modern; it's traditional, and that's why he was so influenced by people like El Greco and Goya and all these fellas. And Picasso didn't talk about it. He let these art historians and biographers just go blindly on their own way into a dead end. And Picasso said, very clearly that people who make art their business are mostly imposters. He was absolutely serious. And it's about time that we realized the seriousness of that accusation and what it's led to. Anyway, there's a sort of a little aside associating us back with traditional art, and it couldn't get more traditional than ancient Egypt. So let's move back to Les Demoiselles and go deeper into this epic cartoon that he's left us hidden in the lines and the blocks of color of this so-called modern art painting. So this was the next image in the slideshow, and the accompanying text was something like Horus stands with sword at hand. And what I'm suggesting is that we have these cartoon characters. If you may remember Toth looking on over at on the right hand side, who's not visible in this particular version of the image, and he's looking at these two characters, the one to the left who's in the shadows, and this one who's highlighted in front of us. And he seems to be holding in his hand a blade. Now, this could be easily interpreted as a blade. Now, the figure obviously distorted. You've got hands coming from the wrong places, arms terminating in the wrong way, arms originating in the wrong place is typical sort of Picasso rearrangement of anatomy. But what we've got is we've got the elements of a human figure with what appears to be an animalistic type head with bird elements. And if you look at ancient Egyptian representations of Horus, he's often represented in precisely this way, with a human body with a bird's head, the head of a falcon. So we've got an image of Horus with standing, holding a sword and ready for action against his uncle Set, who's over there on the left. It's a very cartoon-like impression of all this. Now, what's interesting about it is that that thing that I'm suggesting is a sword, that piece of drapery or whatever it's supposed to be, is almost identical to ancient Iberian swords. Horus was known for his preferred weapon being a sword. He was a sword. He liked his swords. Normally these characters have a preferred weapon, and with Horus it was the sword. And so I looked at Egyptian swords, and there were a few that were sort of a little bit along these lines, but not quite. But there was nothing precisely along these lines that I could find in museum collections and stuff. But what I did discover was that ancient Iberian swords were precisely like this. So that's an interesting observation, because of course Picasso was Spanish, and he may well have known that old swords look like this where he came from, and he, as I say, he had this savant's memory for imagery, and whether or not it was intentional, I couldn't say, but it's very theatrical. It's almost as if it's being carried out on a stage. And of course, Picasso was involved in this kind of, in Barcelona, just before the turn of the century. He'd helped in these puppet show presentations, and I think he'd also been involved in school plays in Malaga before this. But because there are some pictures which, to my way of looking at it, I would say they were representations of school plays being reenacted, and in his early juvenilia, and there are strong suggestions of that being the theatrical sort of debut, if you like. So the second stage of that would be Barcelona, with these puppet shows and things that were held at El Catrigat. So we've got this idea of the whole thing being carried out on a stage as if it's a performance. So this is the full version, the subsequent image in the slideshow, the full version of Set. And here we see him from a bit more of a distance, and he appears to be doing a number of things. He's standing there wearing what looks very reminiscent of an Egyptian loincloth, typical kind of thing that was worn in ancient Egypt. And you can see he's got two arms, one of which is holding a head. I think you can just about see that. I'll use my cursor. So the African friend is now in the hands, this hand being the hand of Set. It's the inverted boat, in another way of looking at it. And here we have the other arm, and in another image I'm going to show you that this shape here next to his hand is in a very, very reminiscent form, this P shape, to an Egyptian axe. It's almost identical. So it's like almost like a cartoon representation of an Egyptian axe. And this comes back later on in the discussion of Les Demoiselles. And I'll show you some related imagery to that. So what have we got? We've got these three characters. We've got, using the cursor again, we've got the god Toth here sitting watching this battle going to take place. We've got Horus here with his sword, and we've got the suggested form here of Set, the uncle of Horus, who murdered Horus's father, standing there with a raised axe, possibly, suggested at least, and wearing this kind of garb that is very reminiscent of Egyptian clothing, typical of the time, and he seems to be holding this form with all these eyes of Horus. Okay, so of course in the story Horus loses an eye to Set, so this would be very consistent imagery if my theory about it is correct. It would be entirely consistent with the legend. And as we proceed into it, I'll explain more of the finer details. But for the time being, I think that will serve. And so there it is, cartoon, full version of the god Set about to do battle with Horus. And the whole thing being overseen by the god Toth over to the right. So down here in the bottom right we have I think it's a facsimile, I'm not sure, of an Egyptian axe. It may be an original axe head with a newly crafted shaft, but in any event we have some bronze axe heads from ancient Egypt above. You can see the shape of them, which is suggested here in this P shape here, if you follow my cursor up here in the hand of Set. You can see this shape suggested here of this kind of thing, this curved semicircular shape. And here, coming to the other weapon in this battle, the sword. Well, this sword looks very similar to what's below, and these are Iberian swords, ancient Iberian swords found in Spain or Portugal, certainly on the Iberian Peninsula. Many of them of this era were in this shape, and it's just a feeling that I've got that Picasso might have seen some of these in a museum somewhere, perhaps even in Malaga, and this photographic memory of his coming to the surface in his depiction of this. But interesting similarities going on in these two little areas of Les Demoiselles. Here, the thing I'm suggesting is the axe being used by Set against Horus in this battle, and Horus has one of these kind of swords in his hand. The eventual weapon he uses against Set, of course, is a spear, which again reinforces the association with Picasso by way of his name, meaning this, very severe form of being stabbed. Picasso is a stab. It's being stabbed. That's what the name means. So he's obviously lost his sword at this point, and he's picked up a spear, and that's the final blow that he deals to Set. Is a spear wound in the mythology anyway. So we have Set, the dark force, Horus representing his father Osiris, who has been murdered in the middle here, and now we reintroduce our friend the Harlequin, who is in the form of Toth, the principal representative of Ra, the messenger of the high gods. Now, one of Toth's main functions was to be the force that brought balance to situations that were out of balance. And the implication here is that Seth has done something fairly evil. He's killed his own brother. So along comes Toth to balance and correct the situation. And by way of his magic and his powers, he helps Horus to win the battle. The conflict is decided by Toth in the form of readdressing the imbalance in the situation. Horus defeats Set, he stabs him with a spear, and he becomes the god of the sky. Because Horus is often depicted as in this bird form, and it's within this area that we get a lot of Horus-related details. If you follow my cursor, we have this inverted head of Horus here as the falcon head, the Eye of Horus, two of those. So there are elements of wings and this falcon-type headed suggestion of a bird with all the elements of the Horus iconography and the suggestion of a tail. So I'm going to leave it here. I'll be back with the final part of the story of Horus and Set and the outcome and what it all signifies, as far as I can tell. All this sort of hidden, in the superficial image of this Barcelona brothel, and the minds of those that see it. So please come back for part 2. We have a lot more to see, and there's some really surprising material to follow. So thanks for looking, and see you soon.